Somewhere in a government archive right now, there are boxes of documents about the space race that you are still not allowed to read. Not because the information is dangerous in the way a weapon is dangerous, but because it reveals exactly how much of the golden age of space exploration was never really about science at all. It was about power, surveillance, and a level of secrecy so extreme that some of the men who worked on these programs could not tell their own wives what they did for a living. Today, we are going deep into the space race secrets that remain classified or were only declassified decades after the fact. The spy satellites disguised as science missions, the military space stations built to watch the Soviet Union from orbit, and the disasters that were hidden from the public for years. This is not speculation. This is documented history that took decades of freedom of information requests and government leaks to finally come to light. And by the end of this video, you will understand why the space race was never as innocent as the postcard images of rockets and flags made it look. Let's start with the program that arguably shaped the entire trajectory of the Cold War in orbit, and yet almost nobody outside of intelligence circles knew it existed until 1995. Project Corona. Publicly, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, the United States was flying a series of satellites under the cover name Discoverer, officially described as a scientific and biological research program studying the effects of space on living organisms. In reality, Discoverer was almost entirely a cover story. The real payload on most of these missions was a film-based reconnaissance camera system designed to photograph Soviet military installations, missile sites, and air bases from orbit, then eject the film canister back down through the atmosphere in a capsule that would be caught midair by a specially equipped aircraft trailing a hook. Think about how insane that sounds for a moment. A camera in space, ejecting physical film, falling back to Earth, and being snatched out of the sky by a plane before it ever touched the ground. Corona ran for over a decade, flew more than 145 missions, and captured images so detailed they fundamentally changed how American intelligence agencies understood Soviet military capability. It remained entirely classified until President Clinton ordered its declassification in 1995, more than 20 years after the program ended. For over 2 decades, an entire generation grew up during the space race with no idea that some of the most consequential missions of that era were not about the moon at all. While Corona was quietly reshaping Cold War intelligence, another program was unfolding that most people have still never heard of, the Manned Orbiting Laboratory, or MOL. Announced publicly in 1963, MOL was presented to the American public as a scientific space station, a place where astronauts would study the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body. That was the cover story. The actual purpose of MOL was to put trained military astronauts into orbit inside a station, equipped with an extraordinarily powerful telescopic camera system, codenamed Dorian, capable of photographing objects on the ground, with a level of resolution that remained classified for decades. The astronauts selected for MOL were essentially meant to become human operators for the most advanced orbital spy camera ever built at that point, manually adjusting and maintaining equipment that automated satellites of that era simply could not match. The program was canceled in 1969, partly because automated reconnaissance satellites had advanced enough to make a manned platform unnecessary, and partly because of ballooning costs. Several of the MOL astronauts, including some who never flew a single mission, were quietly transferred to NASA and went on to fly space shuttle missions years later. The full technical specifications of the Dorian camera system were not declassified until 2015, 46 years after the program was canceled, revealing that its optical resolution was more advanced than intelligence officials had ever publicly admitted. Now let's talk about the disasters, because secrecy during the space race was not limited to surveillance programs. It extended to failures the Soviet Union desperately did not want the world to see. The N-1 rocket program is perhaps the most dramatic example. While NASA's Saturn V successfully carried astronauts to the moon, the Soviet Union was racing to develop its own moon rocket, the N-1, a massive vehicle powered by an enormously complex cluster of 30 individual engines. The N-1 program suffered 4 catastrophic launch failures between 1969 and 1972, including one explosion so powerful it remains among the largest non-nuclear detonations in human history, leveling the launch pad and killing several ground personnel. The Soviet government did not officially acknowledge the existence of the N-1 program to its own citizens, let alone to the rest of the world, until years after the program was quietly canceled in 1974. For over a decade, the full scale of the Soviet Union's failed moon rocket program remained essentially invisible outside of a small circle of engineers and officials, hidden behind the broader narrative of Soviet space triumphs like Sputnik and Gagarin's historic flight. Then there is the story of the cosmonauts who may have died in missions the Soviet Union never officially admitted took place. This area sits closer to the edge of verified history and persistent rumor, and it deserves to be treated with intellectual honesty rather than sensationalism. Throughout the 1960s, rumors circulated in the West, some originating from amateur radio operators who claimed to have intercepted distress transmissions, suggesting that the Soviet Union may have experienced fatal spaceflight failures that were never publicly disclosed, occurring before or between the missions that were officially announced. The Soviet Union's well-documented pattern of only announcing missions after they had succeeded, rather than before launch, meant that a failed or fatal mission could theoretically be erased from the public record simply by never mentioning it in the first place. To this day, no verified documentary evidence has surfaced proving the existence of these so-called lost cosmonauts, and most space historians consider the strongest versions of this theory unproven. What is documented and confirmed, however, is that the Soviet space program suffered real fatalities that were initially concealed or downplayed, including the death of cosmonaut Valentin Bondarenko in a training accident in 1961, whose death was not publicly acknowledged until 1986, a full 25 years later, during the era of Soviet openness known as glasnost. Back on the American side, secrecy did not end when the shuttle era began. The Space Shuttle program, publicly marketed as a reusable, cost-effective platform for scientific and commercial missions, also flew a number of classified Department of Defense missions throughout the 1980s. On these missions, launch times were often not publicly announced in advance. Mission patches sometimes featured deliberately vague or symbolic imagery instead of clear mission details, and post-launch press briefings provided minimal information about payloads, which in several cases were believed to be reconnaissance or communications satellites for the National Reconnaissance Office. Some details of these missions, including specific payload identities and objectives, remain classified to this day, more than 3 decades later. The public knows these missions happened. The public still does not know, in several cases, exactly what those shuttles carried into orbit or what those payloads were designed to do once deployed. There is also the matter of the X-37B, and while this program is more recent than the classic space race era, it represents a direct continuation of the same tradition of secrecy in orbit. The X-37B is an autonomous, reusable spaceplane operated by the United States Space Force, and it has flown multiple missions lasting hundreds of days, in one case remaining in orbit for over 900 days consecutively. The vehicle's actual mission objectives, payloads, and specific orbital activities remain almost entirely classified. Officials have offered only broad, general statements about testing reusable spacecraft technology and conducting experiments, without specifying what those experiments actually involve. Speculation from space analysts ranges from testing sensor and reconnaissance technology to experimenting with satellite servicing and even potential anti-satellite capability. But without official confirmation, much of this remains informed analysis rather than established fact, and it is important to be clear about that distinction. So why does this pattern of secrecy matter, beyond simple historical curiosity? Because it reshapes how we understand the entire narrative of the space race that most of us grew up with. The story we were told was one of pure scientific ambition, a noble competition to expand human knowledge and reach for the stars. The declassified record shows a more complicated truth, one where scientific achievement and military intelligence gathering were often two sides of the exact same coin, where the same rockets that carried astronauts to historic milestones were developed alongside programs explicitly designed for orbital surveillance, and where both superpowers were willing to conceal failures, and in some documented cases fatalities, rather than admit vulnerability to their rival or to their own citizens. None of this diminishes the genuine scientific and human achievement of programs like Apollo. Neil Armstrong's footprints on the lunar surface are just as real and just as extraordinary regardless of what else was happening in classified programs running in parallel. But understanding the full picture, the surveillance programs hidden behind scientific cover stories, the disasters concealed for decades, and the missions that remain classified even today, gives us a far more complete and honest understanding of what the space race actually was. As we sit here decades later, watching new classified programs like the X-37B continue that same tradition of orbital secrecy, it raises a genuinely important question about where the line should sit between national security and public transparency in space. Reconnaissance capability arguably remains one of the most sensitive categories of military technology in existence, and reasonable people can disagree about how much of it should ever be declassified and how soon. What we do know is that history has shown us repeatedly that the truth eventually surfaces. Corona took over 2 decades. The Dorian camera specifications took nearly half a century. Cosmonaut Bondarenko's death took 25 years to be publicly acknowledged. Whatever is currently sealed away in classified archives about today's space programs will, in all likelihood, eventually see daylight too. The only real question is how long we will have to wait. If you found this deep dive into the hidden side of the space race as fascinating as I did researching it, subscribe to the channel, because we cover the real, documented history behind space exploration that rarely makes it into the mainstream story. Hit the notification bell so you catch the next investigation the moment it drops. Let me know in the comments which classified program surprised you the most, and I will see you in the next video.